Welcome to Issues That Matter. My guest today is my friend Scott Ritter, and we're going to talk about the origins of Hamas. But, Scott, before we get into that conversation, we had a conversation a while back on your perception of we're 1 second away from doomsday, and that was before the Middle East crisis. What's the time frame right now?
Well, it's the same. I mean, there's only one nuclear power involved in the Middle East crisis, and that's Israel. And the conditions don't exist right now for Israel to use nuclear weapons. That doesn't mean that if the current violence in the Middle East, if it expanded to include an Israeli-Iranian conflict, um, and things went south, on the battlefield, the Israeli weapon is not meant to be a preemptive weapon. It's meant to be a weapon of last resort, and the entire notion of deliberate ambiguity regarding Israel's nuclear capacity, where everybody knows it exists, but Israel will not admit it exists, is part of a deliberate plan of that gives Israel a chance to do certain steps before using a nuclear weapon. There is no immediate use of a nuclear weapon by Israel. Uh, phase one of their nuclear posture is, ambiguity. Phase two is where they undertake certain covert means of letting people know that there's something here and you don't want to do what you're doing. Phase two can involve public statements made by Israeli officials. For instance, in 2004, we saw Ariel Sharon allude to the existence of a nuclear weapon by Israel. We saw Prime Minister Omer do the same thing back in 2006. He made a similar allusion. Um, and we can also see actions undertaken by Israel that are designed to send a signal that bad things can happen. In 1991, for instance, Israel sent a signal to Iraq that if they use chemical weapons or biological weapons against Iraq, put them on Scud warheads and fire them, that Israel would respond with a nuclear strike on Baghdad. And to drive that point home, Israel pulled one of its Jericho 2 missiles out and fired it, test fire, using the exact range from the launch site to Baghdad, but they fired it into the Mediterranean. And this was a signal to Iraq that if you use chemical weapons, we'll use a nuclear weapon. But even if you get past phase two and it comes time to use it, what Israel would do then is announce that they have nuclear weapons. Say, we have a nuclear weapon and we're prepared to use it. And if people went, well, we don't believe you, then they do an underground test. And if people still didn't believe them, they do an above ground demonstration. And at that point in time, if people continue to do that, which Israel says you shouldn't be doing, they will use a nuclear weapon against the target. So, the Israeli nuclear weapon is not the trigger for global nuclear annihilation. It's actually a weapon that has a lot of built-in constraints. Um, the threat comes from the American arsenal and the Russian arsenals. This is where the real risk of nuclear conflict has been, is, and will be. This is where we get down to, I said 1 second, less than a second, because all it takes is just one moment of stupidity and it's over.
So, I called you to do something, the origins of Hamas. From your perspective, how did Hamas come into being?
Well, it's not my perspective, it's what reality is.
Okay.
Starting in 1973, um, a Sunni religious figure, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, established a center in the Gaza Strip that was affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood is a Sunni Islamist movement that has been called a terrorist organization by the Egyptian government. The Syrian government went to war against them in 1982, drove them out of Syria. Um, and they've taken refuge in Turkey, etc. The center in Gaza was seen as a refuge for the Muslim Brotherhood from the crackdowns taking place against the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, where to be a member of the Muslim Brotherhood became a death sentence. In sometime in the mid 1980s, I can't remember the exact date, 1986, 1987, around there, the Sheikh Yassine's center transitioned into Hamas. Hamas was opposed to the position taken by the Fatah movement of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which was appeared to be willing to enter into discussions with the state of Israel about the creation of a two-state solution to the Palestinian-Israeli problem. The Hamas position was that Israel didn't have a right to exist, and that a Palestinian state should incorporate all of the region of Palestine, and that there would be no independent Jewish state. And Hamas was opposed to the Oslo Accords signed by Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat. 1993, I think the first one was. 1995 would have been the Oslo II. They carried out terrorist actions designed to deride this, and again, they were in opposition to Fatah, so they're not part of the mainstream Palestinian movement. There are many people who believe that Hamas's existence was encouraged by the Israelis because, like Hamas, Israel is opposed to the two-state solution, at least certain elements within the Israeli body politic. Up to including the prime minister's office, meaning that there's a lot of political pressure placed on Israel to be seen as moving forward with a two-state solution. But if the Israelis could sabotage that, not by being the ones responsible for sabotaging it, but by having an outside party, preferably a Palestinian party, sabotage that, that takes the political heat off of Israel. So even though Israel wasn't planning the terrorist attacks and stuff, there's many people who say that Israel benefited from the terrorist attacks of the 1990s because it made implementation of a two-state solution very, very difficult. Yitzhak Rabin, however, worked through this difficulty and, like I said, signed the two Oslo Accords and was moving aggressively forward with a peace plan for Palestine when he was assassinated on November 4th, 1995, by a Benjamin Netanyahu supporter who believes that Benjamin Netanyahu gave the green light for him to kill Yitzhak Rabin. And now we see the beginning of the end of the peace process. Benjamin Netanyahu becomes prime minister. He starts to dismantle the Oslo Accords. And this, of course, only further enrages Hamas, who doubles down on their terrorist actions, etc. But the political situation for Israel became very difficult with the settlements, because when Benjamin Netanyahu came in, they instituted a policy of building settlements in Gaza. Again, these fanatic Israeli Zionists were trying to take over Gaza by building settlements, claiming it as part of Greater Israel. And the decision was made, of course, that these settlements had to be dismantled, that they become a political impediment for the Israelis. The world was rallying around the cause of the Palestinians. In 2004, the International Court of Justice put out a memorandum based largely upon what the building of the wall of a wall on the West Bank and what's going on in Gaza, saying that Israel was an occupying power and therefore had no inherent right of self-defense from anything that occurs from within the zone of occupation. And so this was increasingly difficult for Israel. So they were going to withdraw from Gaza, but they didn't want Fatah to move in and take over. So they encouraged, again, indirectly, the transition of Hamas from a terrorist resistance organization into a governing body, a political party capable of governing in the Palestinian lands. Again, the idea wasn't to actually have them take power. The idea was for them to divide Fatah, to weaken Palestinian unity, and therefore perpetuate the ability by Israel to forestall or prevent altogether the creation of a Palestinian homeland, a two-state solution. Well, the Hamas project exceeded beyond their wildest dreams. It became a nightmare because not only did Hamas transition into a governing body, but there were elections held, and Hamas won the majority of the elections for the legislative body of the Palestinian Authority, which means that they had become the dominant political party, stronger than Fatah. This, of course, wasn't acceptable to Fatah, to the Palestinian Liberation Organization, etc. And so there was a civil war that broke out between Fatah and Hamas. Hamas was largely cleansed from the West Bank area, where Fatah had a major presence, but Fatah was cleansed from the West, from Gaza. Hamas took over. So the Gaza Strip from 2006, 2007 onwards became an exclusive zone under Hamas control. And again, that was something that was facilitated by the Israelis with that outlook in mind, by believing that by having Hamas in Gaza and Fatah in the West Bank, that the Palestinian Authority would be perpetually weakened. And it was a plan that was working. I just remind people that in 2019, President Trump, then President Trump, implemented or put into motion something called the Abraham's Accord. And a key aspect of that was creating the conditions for a two-state solution that were so impossible, so improbable, that there would never be a Palestinian state. And meanwhile, leapfrogging over that by giving lip service to a Palestinian state, creating the conditions that there would never be a Palestinian state, leapfrogging over that into normalization with Arab nations who said we wouldn't normalize with Israel until there was a two-state solution. So they put in place something, they put all the blame on the Palestinians, saying they need to agree to this. And now we're going to normalize relations with the Arab world. The final, piece of that puzzle was normalization with Saudi Arabia. And there was active talks about that happening imminently. There were, Joe Biden used this concept of Israeli-Arab engagement to promote the India-Middle East Economic Corridor during the G20 meeting when held in India that would see, uh, goods shipped from Mumbai, India to Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates get on trains that would transit the UAE into Saudi Arabia, into Jordan, into Israel, to Haifa, and from Haifa to a port in Greece. This is the big plan. It was such a big deal that Benjamin Netanyahu, instead of putting up a cartoon of an Iranian bomb like he is wont to do when he speaks before the General Assembly debate, brought a map that showed the same corridor and said Israel's going to be a major part of this. That was the world that they were talking. No talk about a Palestinian state, none whatsoever. Nobody was talking about a Palestinian state until October 7th, when Hamas launched its military assault against the Israelis. And now everybody's talking about a Palestinian state. And here's the complexity of it. It's only happened because of what Hamas did. Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, is such a weakened leader. He has no credibility. He's sold out to Israeli interests, to American interests. He doesn't represent the best interests of the Palestinian people. Fatah has become a largely disenfranchised movement, again, because they're linked to Abbas. It's Hamas that gets all the credit for putting a two-state solution on the table, which is ironic given the fact that Hamas had been the organization that said we oppose a two-state solution back when they were created. They're now the ones responsible for putting that solution on the table. This has been pretty much an Israeli project that has backfired in the extreme.
So what triggered October 7th?
Well, first of all, we have to understand that it was a plan at least a year in the making, probably longer. What I think it was a plan deliberately built around the Yom Kippur holiday. They needed the Israelis to basically go into a sleep mode on that day, so that their guard was down, that troops were at home, commanders were at home, the nation was in a pause, similar to what happened 50 years ago in 1973 when Egypt went across the Suez Canal and the Syrians stormed in the Golan Heights. Israel had gone into a Yom Kippur slumber. And so that date had been picked. What triggered it was the Abrams Accords. The fact that Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, had allowed this to happen, allowed this agreement to be put forward that nullified the possibility or probability of a Palestinian state, all in the cause of promoting a Palestinian state. Everybody's saying in the Abrams Accord, we want a Palestinian state, but here are the conditions that have to exist for it, and meant that there wouldn't be a Palestinian state. It was the end of the aspirations of the Palestinian people, and the final nail in the coffin would have been normalization of relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia. And so Hamas needed to do something that ripped up this paradigm, that did a complete transformation of the geopolitical reality of the Middle East. And this is what the attack did. It basically created the conditions that, to solve the problem that manifested through Hamas's actions of October 7th, the world would have to agree that there needs to be a two-state solution. And that's where we're at right now. Hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of demonstrators around the world demanding a Palestinian state. The United States government, for the first time in a long time, saying their number one diplomatic priority is the creation of a two-state solution. This is all because of Hamas's action. The other thing that happened was that there are thousands of Palestinians held prisoner by Israel in the most deplorable conditions. Many of these are women and children. I just want to reemphasize that last point for all your listeners. Children, over 130 of them, many of them under the age of 10, whose only crimes were to throw a rock at an Israeli tank or make some sort of gesture to an Israeli soldier. But they've taken children and they've put them in jail, in prison. No due process, no crime set forth, no charges. They're just there in perpetuity under very bad conditions. Hamas, being a governing agency, cares for its people. And they've been telling the Israelis for some time now that they need to release these people, and Israel refuses to do it. They continue to arrest more and more and more and more. So one of the goals and objectives of Hamas was to seize hostages for the purpose of facilitating an exchange to free the prisoners that Israel had taken. Israel had, in fact, taken hostages too, and were holding them over the head of Hamas. So one of the purposes of October 7th, one of the triggers was thousands of people in prison. Now look what's happening. As we speak, in Qatar, an agreement has been reached, whether or not they can get to actual implementation, but an agreement has been reached to exchange 100 Israeli hostages and for the release of all women and children prisoners held by Israel. All women and children prisoners held by Israel. This is a huge victory for Hamas, because without October 7th, Israel would never have released these people. But now Hamas, by taking hostages, has created the conditions where where this is going to happen. And I believe that there will be additional exchanges until all the political prisoners taken by Israel are released. And then the last thing was the Al-Aqsa Mosque. What triggered this, the October 7th, is called Operation Al-Aqsa Flood. Why? Why? I mean, if you're so ignorant about the Middle East situation that you don't know that the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem is the third holiest shrine in all of Islam, and that the Israelis have been going in, throwing tear gas inside to disrupt the worshiping, beating up women, beating up men, terrorizing people, and allowing settlers to go in and to desecrate this site. This is the third holiest site in Islam. This would be like allowing Jews to go inside the Vatican and mock the Sistine Chapel and to hold raucous Jewish celebrations there. Christianity would be outraged. And yet everybody's just silent when the Israelis do it to the Muslims in the Al-Aqsa Mosque. No, you don't get to do that. And Hamas is saying that has to come to an end. And so any agreement that's reached finally will, I believe, be one that incorporates respecting the sanctity of the Al-Aqsa Mosque and making it a no Israel zone, meaning no Israel security forces, no Israeli police, no Israeli settlers, nobody. The only people that can go in the Al-Aqsa Mosque are those who were approved by the relevant religious authorities responsible for that, Muslim authorities, not Jewish authorities. Again, this would not have happened if it weren't for what happened on October 7th. the attack by Hamas, the military attack. And let's call it what it is. It was the most professionally executed large-scale raid carried out by a light infantry force in modern history. Now, the Israelis will say it was an act of terrorism. No, it was a military assault against legitimate military targets. What about the 1,400 dead? Well, most of them were soldiers. And of the civilians, estimated 80% of those civilians were killed by the Israelis themselves. We now know that the Apache helicopters fired indiscriminately against the people trying to flee for their lives from the crossfire that had ensued between Hamas fighters and Israeli security forces, that the Apache helicopters couldn't differentiate between them, so they killed everybody. We now know that the Israeli police forces, their special forces hostage rescue team, Yaman, when recapturing Berry, was in communications with hostages who said, we're in this building, they're ready to surrender. And they made the option to fire in with tank runs and kill everybody anyways, that the majority of the people who died from the majority of the civilians who died that day were killed by Apache helicopters, Merkava tanks, or Israeli Defense Force, panicked Israeli Defense Force. This was a military assault carried out by Hamas to achieve political objectives. Wars and essential politics by other means. And so it's legitimate for them to do this. And as I just told you, it appears that they're well on their way to achieve all political objectives of this operation. This will go down as one of the greatest victories for the Palestinian cause in the history of the Palestinian cause, because of what Hamas did. There's a real possibility or probability of there being a Palestinian state. On October 6th, there was no possibility of that. Today, it's there only because of Hamas.
Do you think this is going to be a protracted situation?
No, I don't think it's going to be a protracted. Well, I mean, the political aspect of it, getting a Palestinian state, yeah, this could take time. The biggest obstacle to a Palestinian state after Benjamin Netanyahu, who is a self cleansing problem. He's a failed politician who was at the helm when Israel suffered its greatest humiliation in its history. So his future is nil. But after him, the biggest problem is Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority. He's the number one impediment to this. He needs to go. They need to purge Fatah and get people in Fatah who better represent the genuine will of the Palestinian people and will work, tirelessly in support of the formation of a Palestinian state. Because there's going to have to be, Fatah and Hamas don't like each other. They, like I said, a civil war. They're not on the same side, so to speak. They're going to have to learn how to work together, because I do believe one of the political compromises of this is that Hamas won't be able to sit at the table. That's just asking too much of Israel. But to get Israel to the table, to sit with the Palestinian Authority, Hamas will continue to exist behind the scenes, exerting pressure on the Palestinian negotiators to ensure that there is a Palestinian state. But this can't go on. The United States, we have a presidential election coming up. People may not have realized that, but we've got one. And we're into the silly season, which means the tiniest issues become big political problems. And in this case, it ain't a tiny issue. The ongoing genocide by Israel against the Palestinians is manifesting itself politically here. The Congress can censure, the Congresswoman from Michigan for making statements that were deemed to be anti-Semitic, even though they're not. Why do we allow the Anti-Defamation League to determine what the term anti-Semitic is? Speaking out in defense of the Palestinian people and the creation of a Palestinian statehood is never anti-Semitic. From the river to the sea, it isn't just a Hamas charge, it's a Likud party charge. Go to the original charter of the Likud party and see what they stand for, and you really realize that they are far more terroristic than Hamas is. And of course, Netanyahu is a member of the Likud party. So the Anti-Defamation League really should be, again, I believe in freedom of speech. You can exist. Register as a foreign agent of Israel. That's what you are. And understand that you don't get to tell anybody how to define a certain term. Anti-Semitism is not defined by the Anti-Defamation League. It's defined by what it really means. And it doesn't mean being anti-Israel. There is no connectivity between Semitism and Israel. There's no connectivity between Semitism and political Zionism. One can condemn political Zionism and be opposed to Israeli policies and not be anti-Semitic, but not according to the Anti-Defamation League. But the problem is that while Congress can censure the Congresswoman, they can't censure the American people. and they can't censure the American voter. And Michigan is a swing state that's become very critical and pivotal for the upcoming presidential election. Joe Biden's going to lose Michigan right now as things stand because of the stance he's taken with Israel and Gaza. And he may lose other states because it's not just the Arab population that's rejecting this. Large Jewish population percentages are objecting this. Many Americans are objecting this. 300,000 people or more were in the streets of Washington, D.C. When was the last time you saw 300,000 people in the streets of Washington, D.C. closing in on the White House, demanding that President Biden change his policies vis-a-vis Palestine and Israel? When did you see that? You haven't seen that. First time in history. Around the world, millions of people are rallying to the Palestinian cause. This creates a political imperative that has to be addressed sooner rather than later. And so I don't see this problem dragging out forever, because politically it's unsustainable. Too much damage has been done. As we speak, American diplomats around the world, especially in the Middle East, are sending cables to the State Department, to the White House, saying, we've lost the Arab world. We've lost the Arab world. We're losing the global South. So much damage has been done to America's relations with the Arab world because of our continued blind support for Israeli genocide against the Palestinian people, that we're losing them. We've lost them. This is a huge diplomatic defeat for the United States. If we're going to recover, we have to alter our policy direction vis-a-vis Israel and Palestine. And this isn't just about giving lip service to a Palestinian state. We actually have to act on it. We can't act on it till the fighting stops. And so you're going to see the United States put more and more pressure on Israel to stop the fighting.
Wow. So I'm sure that you and I will have other conversations as this, proceeds. So, Scott, thank you so much for being on Issues That Matter. Your final thoughts, if you've got any?
Well, all I do is think about these issues. I guess, I like to temper the emotions here, because there's a lot of emotions running around. And I myself am extremely harsh on Israeli policies and political Zionism in general. But I'll tell you this right now. If there was ever a mob of people moving in on a synagogue in the Albany area or a Jewish center in the Albany area, I'll be the first person out in front of those places to defend them against that mob. Because any criticism against Israel is not a condemnation of the Jewish faith. Anti-Semitism is punishing Jews for being Jews. No, we live in the United States of America. We are a nation that's founded on the principles of freedom of religion. That means that you can practice whatever religion you want to practice, so long as you're not hurting anybody. Practice that religion. The Jews have every right to practice their faith as every Christian does, or a Muslim does, or a Buddhist does, or atheists choose not to practice their faith. People who are witches, Wiccans, you get to do whatever you want to do. That's America. And I took an oath to uphold and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And you are a domestic enemy if you're going after Jews for simply being Jews. That is not how this country works. The Jewish faith has nothing to do with what's going on right now. Political Zionism is a secular movement. People need to understand that. Theodor Herzl, the founder of political Zionism, one of their founders back in the late 19th century, was a secular Jew, not a religious Jew. Now, there are some Jews, just like in Islam, just like in Christianity, people who take it to the extreme and promote violence. One only has to look at Northern Ireland and how both Protestants and Catholics used religion to justify mass murder. That's not Christian beliefs. One only has to look at Al-Qaeda and ISIS to see how the religion of Islam gets perverted by extremists who use Islam as a foundation upon which to commit acts of violence. That's not Islam. And the Jewish faith is not what's taking place in Israel today. This is a secular movement to use that uses Judaism as a means to achieve a non-religious outcome. So there's a distinction, and I have to also say that the American Jewish community creates its own problems by, on the one hand, saying that I'm anti-Semitic if I make a linkage between the Jewish faith and Israel. Well, I don't, but I'm anti-Semitic if I do. But on the other hand, they link the Jewish faith with Israel. So they do it, but if you call them out on it, they say you're anti-Semitic. there's two cards that are overplayed today by the American Jewish community. One is the anti-Semitism card, and as I said, the Anti-Defamation League has no right to define this term for anybody. And the second is the Holocaust card. We all know what the Holocaust is, Shoah, the disaster against 6 million Jews. And never again should mean never again, and you should support that. But you can't play the Holocaust card when you yourself are participating in actions that are more Nazi-like than many of the Nazi actions, the genocide, the ethnic cleansing, the the mass expulsions, building ghettos. This is what Israel, the apartheid state, this is what Israel's doing to the Palestinian people. And when people call them out on that and rightfully condemn Israel for its actions, collective punishment, etc., then Israel plays the Holocaust card. You don't get to play the Holocaust card. No, the Holocaust is not just the history of the Jews, it's the history of the world. It's not just the Jewish faith that gets to reflect on it. We all have to reflect on it and how it came to be. And one of the main reasons why it happened is because the Jews became viewed as not like us, as separate from us. And complex history in Europe and such, they became punished, killed collectively. First Crusades, all the way up to the pogroms of Russia and beyond. The Shoah, 6 million Jews being killed by Nazi Germany. We all have to reflect on this. And if you're a Zionist and you're using the Holocaust card to justify your deeds, all you're doing is diluting the impact of the Holocaust. You're creating the conditions in which people will forget the Holocaust because you've misused its memory. You're using it to promote mass murder today, not to have everybody remember never to allow mass murder again. And so, we need to stand up in defense of what anti-Semitism really means and what the Holocaust really was. And my advice to the American Jewish community is you need to take ownership of these terms and make sure they're used properly and that they aren't linked with what's going on between Israel and Hamas today.
Well, Scott, this has been a wonderful conversation. I have more thoughts, but it would take all afternoon to discuss it. So if I don't see you or hear from you before Thanksgiving, have a wonderful holiday and thank you everybody for listening. Have a great day.